First of all, thank you everyone for joining from pretty much all over the different areas and different time zones. So thank you for taking the time on joining in this Monday. And thank you, Mary. Just wanted to introduce Dr. Mary Gunaratnam. Thank you for joining today in spite of having to rush from a meeting where you were in the fireside chat, where there was the Prime Minister of Canada. Amazing. What a lovely thing to do. Start your Monday morning with. And thank you for taking the time to be with us. Dr. Mary Gunaratnam right now is heading the digital work, and she's the SVP at Northern Credit Union. And may I please request you to introduce yourself really briefly so we can get in there. We are going to talk today about the authentic leadership in the digital era. And Mary, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sangeeta. It's honestly such a pleasure to be here and be a part of this fireside chat series with you. And yes, so I am actually coming back from a fireside chat series with the Prime Minister, Mark Carney. I was extended an invite from the mayor's office, and it was just an incredible honor to be sitting in the same room. And I left feeling really inspired. And honestly, I feel privileged to be coming back to our room and being able to, lead our own fireside chat series here with you today. So that's very neat that it worked out that way. And a little bit about myself. So I do oversee IT at Northern, SVP of IT at Northern. I have about 20 years of experience. I started off my career in coding and development, at RCMP as a software developer. My background is entirely engineering, but I did dabble between healthcare and finance quite a lot. And then I started in the finance world maybe 10 years ago at JP Morgan and had progressive career growth since then. And just on a personal front, I do have two kids, two daughters, and I live here in Canada, in Ottawa, in a small city called Carp.
Great. Um, So, like you mentioned, you have been at an RCMP for people who didn't realize is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And then in the health industry, in the finance industry, that's, spanning quite a few different industries. Can you share like defining moments in your career that shape, your leadership style?
Sure. I think when people ask me this question or, ask me about leadership and defining moments, there may be an expectation to talk about titles or awards, but the truth is, I think my defining moments weren't built in such, it was really built in the messy moments, like the times where I wasn't ready, or when I was scared, or even, I thought I might fail. And I'd say over the years, I had the privilege of talking to a lot of successful people. And one thing that they shared with me is that they all sort of felt that fear and they did it anyways, and they didn't avoid the discomfort. And it usually means you're kind of moving in the right direction. So, kind of going back to your question, I mean, I've been leading IT teams for about 20 years now. And there are a lot of moments where there's crisis within the IT department. And I'm talking about the cybersecurity incidents. And in those moments, a lot of time information wasn't complete. Sometimes it was shifting by the hours, and I'll be honest, like there were nights where I had more questions in my head than answers. But what I've learned is, people aren't really expecting a perfectly polished speech. Like they just want you to be honest and present. And, usually I come back and say, here's what we know, here's what we don't. And I find that doing just that builds trust a lot faster. And If we want to talk about something a bit more recent, another defining moment that's coming to my mind is when I stepped into the role at Northern. I actually walked into a merger and there it was, two cultures, two systems, and the teams for the most part didn't even know if they quite belonged. And I realized that, people weren't actually watching the technical execution or having a perfect plan. They were watching their leaders. And I realized that if the leaders were calm, like the organization was generally calm, but if people were panicked, especially at the top, like the organization was panicked as well. So I guess in that moment, it was really for me to understand that it's a lot to do with your emotional presence as it is about your technical execution. And the biggest defining moment, I'd say, was becoming probably a mom. Because, when you become a mother, like things like um, empathy or prioritization, like these are no longer buzzwords, they're actually survival skills. And for me, being a mom, it really taught me to lead with more humanity, and bring that perspective into the workplace and recognize that people are whole human beings and not just employees. And actually, going back, I don't think I can talk about biggest defining moments without actually giving a shout out to a person that made a considerable difference in my life. And that was my former boss at JP Morgan. I don't know if he's watching or not, but it was Mr. Paul Brown. And I'm mentioning his name because he hired me at the time as VP overseeing the PMO office for Canada.
Mhm.
And I think the role required like 15 years of experience, maybe 10 years at the senior leadership level. At the time, I was quite young. This was 10 years ago. I didn't tick all of the boxes. The recruiter was aware, he was aware, but he hired me anyways. And, he supported throughout my career with great references, which led to numerous other opportunities since then. And I think, I do believe that he saw potential in me at that point where I was seeing gaps. And I feel that trust changed my career. And what I've learned from that is that the best leaders, they see who you are and who you can become, and then they kind of let you grow into that. And so just going back, I know I've went on a few tangents, but going back to, the defining moments that shaped my leadership careers, I can say, here's what I know. Like, it did not happen when I was comfortable. It did not happen when I thought I had all of the answers. Um, it largely, it happened when I was unprepared and I felt stretched. And I think if there's one thing that I want people to remember from this is that feeling that fear doesn't mean that you're in the wrong place. It usually just means that you're, stretching beyond your comfort zone. And we hear this often. Growth happens when you go beyond your comfort zone. And I just think if you learn to lean into that fear and you can sit with that discomfort, those are the very moments that shape you.
True, because if you don't try, you're not going to succeed. So, can imagine for sure. And I love what you brought about becoming a mom, because that does bring a lot more. I think you also learn patience, if
Oh,
nothing
yes.
else, right? Um,
Absolutely.
so what would you say has been the most rewarding part of your leadership journey so far?
So I think when I think about rewarding part, again, it's not the promotions or, awards or titles. Those do fade. But I think what really stays with me and the part that really fulfills me is watching others grow. And I can tell you some of my most proudest moments were when I had someone on my team. I watched her step into an opportunity that she thought she wasn't ready for. And I remember, and she was one of my direct reports. She was brilliant and she was very capable, but she was also very hesitant. And she didn't really see herself as a leader at that moment. And I gave her a stretch project, and I stood back and I watched her figure it out. And watching her succeed really helped boost her confidence level as well. And it really changed her career trajectory. And, those are the kinds of moments where it makes me pause and think, this is why I lead. And I think also something more relevant, something that's also deeply rewarding, has been watching ideas really ripple beyond me. Like, at Northern, what we started off within the IT departments did become cultural shifts eventually. And this was around, it was centered around building psychological safety or promoting transparency in crises. And seeing those values show up in places where I was not present is when you realize, leadership is it's not about control, but it's really about creating that momentum that really outlives you. And I think for me, the true reward is when your impact is no longer really tied to your presence. And and then sometimes it's like, I'll go into panels or I have people come up to me, and sometimes it's the quiet conversations, like whether it's through mentorship or otherwise, and someone says to you, because of you, I believe I could do this. And that's more valuable than any sort of recognition. And those words really do stick with you forever. Like that's that makes me really proud. And also, I think just generally watching people grow, creating impacts that are, beyond me, and really just coming to realize that leadership isn't about the leader, but it's really about the lives that you shape along the way. And I think that's what really keeps me going, and it makes every challenge really worth it.
So, but as a leader, I'm sure there's so much pressure, as on you as a leader. You are in many high pressure roles and situations. How are you really balancing that aspect of it with the authenticity?
I think this is one of the hardest parts of leadership because people say they want authentic leaders, but the truth is authenticity isn't always easy, especially when the stakes are high and you're balancing being true to yourself with the weight of everyone else's expectations. And I think early in my career, I thought authenticity meant that saying exactly what I felt in that moment. And I quickly learned that, being authentic doesn't really mean dumping raw emotions onto your team. It's really being honest, but not being reckless. And again, some examples I can think of, especially during cybersecurity incidents, is I couldn't share everything straight away, even. So I shared what I could, and I
Mm.
let people know, we had a plan. And authenticity to me at that moment was just being composed and steady and, sharing what I could to the best of my abilities. And there are days where I don't feel confident or certain, but what I've realized is my team, they're not expecting me to be perfect. They're just wanting me to be real and steady, and sometimes just saying, "Here's what we know, here's what we don't." I feel that's still authentic and it's still vulnerable and it still meets the expectations of the role. And as you know, I think, people in general expect leaders to project strength, and strength doesn't mean pretending. I think that, I found that being human and admitting that I'm learning and admitting that I'm stretched actually earns a lot more respect than trying to look polished all the time. And I think at the heart of it, at the core of it, authenticity builds trust. And that trust is something you cannot lead without.
I cannot agree with you more. And I'm going to give you a very, very simple example of this in everyday life. On Saturdays, I have actually a friend who teaches a workout class, and she teaches it choreographed to songs. And once in a way, she will mess up, one little action, and she'll be like, oh my God, I can't believe I messed up. I'm so sorry. And I'm like, listen, I know you're leading here and we are all following you, but you're completely human. And it's actually nice when we see her mess up because it makes us feel better about ourselves that when we mess up, it's okay. So
Yeah,
I absolutely, and I can see the authenticity really coming out at that point. But
absolutely.
I mean, this is true as a leader, right? You have said in leadership roles, these are things that you come across. But what are some of the unique challenges you may have faced just being a woman leader? And if you did, how did you overcome them, or were you able to overcome them?
I think as a women leader, there are unique challenges that you can't ignore. You feel them in the room before you even say a word. And as a woman in a heavily male-dominated industry, I found for me, building confidence was a unique challenge.
Hmm.
And, I see confidence as a muscle. It's something that you build over time. Likely you're not going to be born with it. Likely it will not happen over time, but you continuously need to work on it. And
Right.
when I began my career in technology and finance, for the most part, even in my classes, I was the only woman. And sometimes, as I stepped into the corporate world, I was the youngest in the room as well. And I remember sitting at these tables, and everyone around me spoke louder and they spoke faster and they spoke for a very long time with a lot of certainty. And for a very long time, I mistook that volume for value. Like sometimes it's important to just hear what people are saying as well and the messages being delivered. But I think throughout the critical stages of my journey, especially as I stepped into executive roles, I learned to build confidence. And it was, there were three ways, and I can share that right here. I was actually in a panel just recently, just around this, and I shared it with the group there as well. And it was around first of all, having preparedness or preparation. And I remember when I started my role at Northern, there was a executive leader, a woman that I really looked up to, and she said, "A prepared mind is a prepared mouth." And I remember at the time thinking, okay, that sounds a little bit strange, but now I live by it. And really, what that means at its core is anticipate questions, do your research. Because when you've done the work, you don't need to prove yourself. You're showing up ready. And the other was around knowing your purpose. When you know why you're in that room, it becomes a lot easier to find your voice when you know what purpose you're going to be serving. And another one was around proximity. And really, what this is around surrounding yourself with people, your mentors, your allies who would even speak very highly of you, even if you're not within the room. And because confidence does grow fastest in community, not in isolation. And I think another note to mention here is imposter syndrome, because I think we need to normalize it.
Yeah.
And it's not a sign that you don't belong. I think it's just a sign that you're probably stretching beyond your comfort zone. And I think the goal isn't to eliminate it, but it's to really show up anyways. And importantly, I'd say confidence isn't something that you wait for. It's just something that you continuously practice. And I remember just, little increments, whether it's speaking up or taking a risk or even advocating for yourself, you're building that confidence muscle a bit more and more.
So I have to ask this,
Mhm.
I have met you in person, I'm seeing you here. Let's say you were entering a boardroom or wherever, and you walk in and you're this attractive petite woman, and there are situations where I've been where, I see that people are judged by their looks first, right? And so I know you're talking about confidence, but How do you, when you walk into a room and people see this petite, attractive woman walking in, they're judging you by your looks first. How are you building your presence so that, the people in the room are actually going to take you seriously beyond what they
Yeah.
see, right? Yeah,
Yeah. So we met in San Francisco, and you know
we
very well
did.
I'm 5'1". And, let's talk about perception because I think you're right. The world makes quick judgments, especially about women, especially about women that are considered, pretty. And I think people assume they think they know your story before you even speak. They assume ease, people assume shortcuts, people assume beauty equals a lack of substance sometimes. And honestly, admiration comes free, but I think respect is earned. And in my career, when I walked into boardrooms, I've been in situations where I was the only woman. And
Mhm.
more often than not, I was the youngest. And sometimes the only person of color as well. And,
Yeah.
far too often, the first evaluation probably started with how I looked and not what I knew. And so I made a decision. I was like, you know what? Let them underestimate me, but I will not let them forget me because I think, I really over the years worked hard to earn respect by being prepared. And we kind of talked about that, but I wanted people to know I meant business. Delivering results even when conditions weren't in my favor, or asking bold questions that others typically avoided. And even standing tall. I'm 5'1", but standing tall when the room tries to shrink you. And I really do think, character is unforgettable. People may form assumptions the moment you walk into a room, and it happens. But I think what matters is how they remember you when you leave that room. And my goal was never to be pretty, but it was to be impactful and to show women that, you don't have to silence one part of yourself to validate another. Like, women can be brilliant and beautiful, they can be strategic and stylish. You can be powerful and kind. Like, we get to define what leadership looks like. So, you know what? If people judge, let them. I think that's their limitation, not mine. So, I think it's also true that, maybe beauty could open doors, but it's not going to be what keeps you in that room. It's the strength, it's the intelligence that keeps you in that room and eventually puts you at the head of that table.
So, you did talk about asking bold questions, right? Can you share a time and maybe you had to make not just like ask a bold question, but make a bold decision, which probably went against the grain.
Yeah, I think every bold decision feels quite risky in the moment. Especially when you're going against the grain, you feel that weight of resistance and you wonder if you'll have enough support to even carry it through. And I can tell you from my experience, that's where the role of someone who advocates for you or a project sponsor becomes really critical. Earlier in my career, when I started off in healthcare, I was leading a project around Iris, and Iris is interagency e-referral information systems. And it was to pass electronic referrals between agencies. And the safe route here was the one that, most clinicians and people preferred was to stick with old workflows. It ultimately meant less disruption, less training, less political risk. And however, I knew if we were to stay with our legacy processes, it also would end up meaning that patients are ultimately waiting longer. There's going to be fragmented data, and it's really not solving for the problems. These clinicians are going to continue to struggle. And the bold decision in that moment was really coming up with a new model for Iris.
Mhm.
One system, one patient view, real-time tracking, but we have to change the process. So at the time, and mind you, this was like 10 years, 15 years ago, we went from scan and send to inputting, data into a database. And at the time, that was disruptive. And the pushback was real. People thought it was too risky, way too ambitious. We're in a clinical setting, it's too disruptive. Even I started to feel the fear in that moment. And that's when I really learned, the importance of having a strong project sponsor or someone who really advocates for you. Because my project sponsor, she didn't just sign off on the decision. She championed it at the executive level. And, she shielded the team from the political resistance that we were faced with. And she
Mm.
really created the space for us to do our work. And I think without that strong backing that we had, the project probably would have stalled under, the weight of objections. And we did roll it out. But within months, I mean, it wasn't smooth. There was a lot of ironing out to do and challenges, and I remember some cultural resistance, but within months, the results were undeniable. I mean, we had patient times that dropped. The clinicians ultimately ended up having better and faster access to information. The data errors that people thought was going to be an issue decreased. So eventually, what started off as quite risky, and it was quite an uncomfortable move, became a clear win. And I'd say, this experience really taught me two things. And one was that first, growth doesn't happen in comfort. And we talked about this quite a lot. And bold decision does require leaning into that fear. But the most important was that, no leader really drives change alone. Like there's that whole community. And a strong project sponsor, especially in this case, was the difference between a bold vision that would have died in resistance and one that
Mm.
actually transformed the organization.
You go, Mary. That was great. So, since we've been talking about like women leaders, as a mom, that would have been quite the balancing act there, as you were going through your journey. So how were you able to balance that and give time to your two kids, still, be the leader or on the way to being a leader at work and there are women now obviously want to have the best of both worlds, right? So you we are ambitious, we want to do well in our careers, but we don't want to feel guilty about, and there comes so much guilt with being a mom, guilty about, not being able to participate in your kids' day-to-day activities and being there for them. So how did you navigate that? And what would you say to women who want to do this?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think we hear, and it's one of the most common questions I get asked, like work-life balance. And,
Yeah.
but first of all, I do want to say I actually don't believe in the word balance. I actually prioritize. And this isn't something that, obviously you do once and check off a list. It's something that I continuously practice every single day because between leading, transformation and managing teams and going to board meetings, and at the same time, I have two young daughters that I'm raising. I've learned that balance, or it doesn't mean that everything is equal. At least I haven't found that perfect formula. It just means that everything gets its moment. And I feel that in a world where we're constantly surrounded by noise, stillness is a strategy. Like when the world around me is accelerating, I intentionally try and slow my mind down. Every day I take maybe 10 minutes and I ask myself, and this is typically before the meetings or in emails, and when I start my day, I take 10 quiet minutes and I try to just breathe. And I ask myself really one grounding question. And it's usually, what really matters today? What are three things I want to get done today? And that small pause in how I start my day really helps me lead with intention and not reaction. And I also try and anchor my energy where it really truly counts. And that's generally people. My family keeps me centered in joy, and my daughters remind me that it's leadership isn't really about the titles, it's about presence. And my team also reminds me that it's not about knowing it all, it's just showing up calm and ready, even when things get messy. So at work, I've tried to create these micro moments of calmness, and it's, whether it's taking a walk between meetings or having a quick gratitude or sharing some reflections at the end of the week or just, having laughter in the middle of a crisis. You try and incorporate these micro moments in of calmness, but also I think at the core of it, true prioritization is about having presence and being present. And it's knowing when to pause and when to say no and to really give yourself permission to breathe. And I think that's what keeps me centered no matter how much the world shifts around me.
And when to say no is such an important skill to have. And I'm sure your daughters are looking at all the stuff that their mom is doing, and it's inspiring them because, I'm sure they want to grow up in a world where they can do something for themselves too, right? So, how do you see, and you have mentioned a lot about, your manager who championed for you, and you yourself are, championing for your team. How do you see women leaders shaping the future of business and technology for that matter?
Sure. So when I think of the future of business and technology, I don't just see new systems or products from women leaders. I actually see new perspectives,
Yeah.
shaping how we build, how we innovate, and I see women leaders being the center of that shift. And for a long time, leadership was defined by hierarchy and control and command. And I think women leaders now are reshaping that definition by bringing forward empathy, um, in technology, especially where innovation really depends on diverse ideas. I think women leaders are really proving that strength and empathy are not opposites, they're actually multipliers. And technology isn't just about code and systems. Ultimately, it's about the people that we serve. And I believe that women leaders are driving that conversation towards human-centered design as well. And we're not just asking, like, can we build this, but should we? And for who does this
Yeah.
serve? And I think that representation really does matter because when young women see leaders that look like them at the highest levels, I think it expands what they believe is possible. And again, if there's one theme I've seen across women leaders is that we feel the fear and we do it anyways, and we learn to lean into that discomfort, and that courage is exactly what's needed for the future of businesses and technology. So, I mean, going back to your questions, like how do I see women shaping the future? I think it's by building businesses and technologies that are more inclusive, that are more human centered, and really redefining what leadership looks like.
So you sort of answered a little bit of the question I was going to ask next, which was what, how do you think diversity in leadership it drives more innovation and just outcomes,
Mhm.
right? Um, is this what you see? It's not just, of course, as women leaders, but also
Mhm.
people coming from different ethnic backgrounds, people coming from other genders, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think when people talk about diversity, especially in the corporate world, it's often framed as a checkbox. It's something to do because it's, quotation, the right thing to do. But it's so much more than that. And I think if everybody around the table looked the same and thought the same and had the same lived experiences, you're not leading, you're actually recycling. And you're simply repeating the past. And innovation, especially, doesn't happen when everybody nods in agreement. I think, when someone asks that question that makes others feel uncomfortable, like, again, what might we leave behind? Or what if we solve this problem differently? Or why are we doing it this way, anyways? And those questions typically come from people who have different lived experiences and, people who are able to see what others don't. And I think that's the spark of true innovation. And homogeneous teams, for the most part, fall into what feels safe. And I've seen this time
Yeah.
and time again. What's worked before, and safe is dangerous. I think it can blind you into disruption until it's too late. And I think generally diverse leadership doesn't let you get comfortable. It introduces that productive tension. And that tension forces better and more sharper, more future-proof decisions. And I've had executives admit and come to me and say, you know what? I really felt uncomfortable, but I'm glad we had this conversation because I typically ask some questions that, is not, may go against the grain or is, some would say would be bold. But I think
Right.
the biggest breakthrough don't happen in comfort. It really does happen in stretch. And I say that over and over again. But at the core of it, when we think about diversity, businesses don't serve just one type of person, and technology doesn't just impact one community. So when the leadership team mirrors only a fraction of the people that they serve, the blind spots do multiply. So I think when the leadership team is as diverse as the marketplace itself, the solutions become more relevant and also more human. And I've lived this through the recent merger as well, when two leadership teams with drastically very different cultures came together. On paper, it looked like a recipe for a conflict. But in reality, I think it was our diversity, the debate, the different ways of solving problems that really helped us build a stronger and more resilient organization. And I think without those voices, we probably would have picked the safe option. And safe would have definitely failed us in the long run. So I think diversity introduces that we demand better questions. It connects us to the people that we serve. And diversity doesn't just change who sits at the table, but I think at the core of it, it changes what's possible at that table.
Yeah, and I think what you said, it makes so much sense that debate is so important, that being open to debate is so important, right? It's not just like, okay, I said this, so let's just go with this, right? When you have the diversity, there are different voices that are talking about things and so that I think makes a huge difference. And I know you had also mentioned as you were going up in your leadership journey, you had so many mentors, so many champions for you. Do you who have you been? Who have been your role models? I know you mentioned a couple, right? But who have been
Mhm.
your mentors, and what kind of impact did they actually have on your journey?
I'd say that not all of my role models have been people I've worked with directly. Some of the most influential people or women are people I've never met, but by watching them and seeing the way that they showed up for themselves, made me believe that it was possible for myself. And I remember watching women, whether it was in global finance or technology or even politics, step into rooms and where they were also the only women, and they didn't just hold their ground, they led with like grace and courage. And for me that was truly inspiring, and it was permission to imagine myself in the same spaces even if I didn't see many women that looked like me. But many of these women also challenged the old model of leadership. They didn't just lead by being the loudest voice, they led with, again, grace and empathy. And watching them really taught me that leadership doesn't have to mean, becoming someone else. You can be powerful and be authentically yourself. So I'd say, while I've had mentors who have guided me directly, and some of which I've named, I've also had models that I've never met. And women who really broke ceilings before I even walked into a room, and women whose courage created space for mine. And I
Mhm.
think, their impact really reminds me that leadership is not just what you do for people, but it's around the doors you hold open, especially for, who may come next and who you may never meet.
So, what does success mean to you then at the end of this all, right?
So I can tell you, and I know we chatted briefly earlier too. Earlier in my career, success meant, especially coming from a very cultured brown family, like success meant having titles, promotions, recognition. It meant proving that I could do the job to prove that I belonged in that room. But I've grown to realize that that definition of success was way too small. And at this stage of my career, success looks very different. Success to me now means building something that outlives me. Not just the projects delivered or the culture shaped or the pathways opened or the people that have been empowered, but it's really if my work makes it easier for the next woman or the next leader, then that to me is success. And success also means that I no longer have to choose between ambition and family, which is something I struggled with very early on. I've learned that I can hold space for both and prioritize each as needed. So, um, to me, I mean, success is walking out of a boardroom after making maybe a tough call and then come back home and be fully present with my kids. Because that matters to me now at this stage of my life way more than chasing the next title. And, at this stage for me, it's not really measured by how high I climb, but how many people I can lift along the way. And being a mentor, especially to women and underrepresented leaders, I think is what gives my career meaning at this point. And if you were to ask me very simply, I'd just say, success to me now is impact over image. It's probably courage over comfort, and ultimately just making sure that the work that I do today makes the path a little bit wider, maybe a bit easier for someone who will come tomorrow.
That's lovely because I can, especially being of South Asian origin, your success is like when your parents can go and brag to others, oh, my son is doing this or my daughter's doing this, and they're the SVP of IT. And at the end of it, it's yes, that's great, but what are you going to, leave for the next generation or the next wave of people to come? So that is definitely something that I know when we spoke about it, I was like, oh, that's just that just makes me feel really warm and fuzzy, right? So, but having said that, if you were to go back and think about your earlier days, were there things you would change? Were there things you would do differently? Were there, knowing what you know now, uh, is there something you would have had to say to your younger self about, don't worry about this, or maybe, what would you do differently?
You know, I don't think I would change something because I feel I needed to go through it so I can
Mhm.
make my mistakes and learn from them. But I think if I do go back and sit with my younger self, the one who was doubting, second guessing, and sometimes shrinking to make
Yeah.
myself fit into the room, I tell her, stop waiting until you feel ready. I spent so much time in my early career thinking, I'll speak up when I'm more experienced, or I'll go for that opportunity when I'm more qualified. And what I know is this, like you're never gonna be 100% ready, and growth always comes before you're ready. And the best opportunities usually do come disguised in discomfort. And the leaders that grow are the ones who step forward anyway. So again, I think, every time I felt that fear, it probably was because I was standing at the edge of growth, or I'd say, I tell my younger self to really lean into that fear because that's where transformation happens. And I'll also tell her this, like, stop trying to be the smartest person in the room because be the one that creates space for others thrive
Right.
and stop shrinking your voice as well. Because I feel that as women, our perspectives aren't just valid, it's absolutely necessary. And maybe I'd also tell myself to not chase titles as, proof of worth, but chase impact, chase learning, and chase a kind of success that really builds something bigger than yourself. So I think if I had to go back and tell my younger self one piece of advice, it'd probably be don't wait for permission. Don't wait until you're ready. Um, feel the fear, lean into it, because that's probably the very moments that scare you are the ones that are going to shape you.
And now I'm going to ask you a question that I really like to ask people. So these are things that you have learned, and there's so much that you have learned through your journey. If you needed to unlearn something, what is it that you would unlearn?
I think if I had to unlearn something from the past, it'd probably be the belief that I needed to have everything figured out before taking the next step. Um, and I'll continue on to that conversation because for a long time I thought readiness meant certainty, and I thought success required, perfect planning, and that confidence will come after once I had all the answers. But every defining moment in my career proved the opposite. I was not ready when I led through cybersecurity incidents or crises. I wasn't ready when I stepped into executive leadership. And I certainly wasn't ready when I became a mother. Like I had to jump into the role and then learn as I go. And yet, those are the moments that have shaped me the most. And so I guess what I'm unlearning is the instinct to wait for clarity.
Mhm.
Because today I'm choosing curiosity over certainty, and it's not easy. I mean, it took a lot of learning, but that unlearning is what continues to define new possibilities for me in both my life and my career.
I like that. I'm writing this down. Curiosity over certainty. I have written a couple of things down. I have even written honest but not reckless. I love that too. Um, since we are talking about authentic leadership in the digital era, and this is going to be my last question. Sorry, we have gone a little bit over here. Um, is everybody's talking about AI, and that's what that's the only thing we are talking about. Oh, well, and then quantum, I guess now. But how do you think AI is featuring in helping lead with more authenticity?
You know what? I think AI isn't replacing leaders. It's replacing that version of leadership that once relied on hierarchy over humanity. And for decades, authority came with title and tenure and having that corner office, and leaders were often the gatekeepers of information.
Mhm.
And what they knew, only they knew. But AI has really changed that balance. Knowledge isn't locked at the top anymore, and insights aren't limited to those that have the loudest voice or the longest resumes. Like now, everybody has access to intelligence. So I think our leadership has to evolve too. And while AI can automate processes, it can analyze patterns, it can even make recommendations. What AI cannot do is earn trust or build a culture or understand that real human struggle. And I think leaders who will thrive in this new era aren't going to be the ones who cling to power, but they're going to be the ones who share it. And they're going to be the leaders who learn to coach and empower teams and listen and collaborate. And I think AI is really exposing a truth we all ignored for far too long. And it's that leadership was never supposed to be about authority. It was always supposed to be about its people. And I think AI is giving us back the most valuable currency, and that's really time to be human again. And authentic leadership is about transparency, and it's about, empathy and AI is actually strengthening those traits in many ways. Like in my role, AI removes a lot of the mundane tasks, so I can be more present with my teams. I remember days where, I would spend days, if not weeks, building PowerPoint slides or presentations or sometimes even reports. And now I can do all of that, repetitive like formatting and all these things very easily in a matter of minutes. And so it gives me back the time so I can really spend more time on my people. And I also think sometimes it reveals the truth and surfaces what's invisible visible, but being careful because when you feed a lot of information into AI systems, and there's biases, hallucination risks, but sometimes you do get to understand, real pain points, or, sometimes you get better sentiments and analytics so we can really understand the people we serve or our teams more intimately. And I think, authenticity isn't one size fits all, and AI can really help conversations and communication styles as well. So people can feel seen as individuals, and at that point, authenticity really becomes lived. So while I think that AI doesn't make leaders authentic, it does give them the space to show who they really are. And, AI and technology may power the future, but I think it's the leaders that are truly authentic who are going to be able to shape that future.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. We barely have any time remaining, but there is one question in the Q&A, and people, if you have any questions, please take the opportunity now. We will spend a couple of minutes, and I will get your questions to Mary. Let me see. There is one question which says, do you have any advice for women who are at the early stages of their career?
If I could leave you with one thought, it would be this. Don't chase certainty and build curiosity, because I'd say in the world that we live now, it doesn't reward people who know it all. You really need to learn, unlearn, and be able to adapt faster with all of the changes that are underway. And I'd say if there's one thing that I've learned, and I've said this many times, is that growth rarely feels comfortable. But every time I walk through that uncertainty, I discovered a new layer of strength I didn't know I had. So my advice would be, stay curious, stay courageous, stay kind, especially to yourself.
There's another question. I actually really like this question. How do you evaluate when it's time to take on a new role or risk or challenge?
Um, I think you feel it in your gut. Like, when you've outgrown something, people in this hyper connected digital world, they really do, they can sense when they've outgrown a position or they're just not finding, the job as interesting as it was. And that's usually an indication to move on. And I'd say listen to it and you'd get that feeling. You know if you've outgrown it and you're ready to move on to the next chapter. Now, I think where people get caught up is that next chapter may seem uncomfortable because it doesn't have certainty. You're going to be meeting new people. You have to go through the process of finding the right fit. But that's all part of learning. And I'd say, listen to your gut and kind of go with that.
Um, One more. Um, Actually, there's a couple more. I think we'll probably need to stop after these two questions, and I'm sure if there are more questions, we can get them to you later. So, one question is, what does a truly inclusive workplace look like in your perspective?
I think based on the culture of the organization, a truly inclusive workplace may look different. But what I can see is an inclusive workplace would be leaders who really build for psychological safety so people can speak up without fear and challenge norms and the status quo. And, the leaders themselves in a truly inclusive workplace would model integrity and build strengths and trust within that team in all the interactions. And they would also, in an inclusive team, I think, empower for autonomy within the team and give the teammates a wide latitude for decision making. Um, because I think in the world that we live in, we're just so overwhelmed by noise. But when you have an inclusive team and the some of these traits become that differentiator to fuel for innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one more last question. What skills will define the next generation of women leaders?
I'd say, if I had to keep it short and sweet, it's going to be the leaders who can learn, unlearn, and adapt.
Hmm.
We talk about IQ and EQ, but AQ, the adaptability quotient, is on the rise, and it's a very important skill to have to be able to adapt to the changing environment.
I love that. Adaptability. One more thing to write down. This is, I just love having these chats because every single time I learn something new, something that I can use myself going forward. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much. Thank you for leaving your wonderful earlier fireside chat a little bit early so you can get here in time. Really appreciate all the insights that you have shared with us. And we should just keep this conversation going. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And looking forward to meet you again in person soon.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for the opportunity. And it's been lovely. It's been my pleasure. And yeah, I'll see you next, probably June. I'll be back in San Francisco. We'll
Sounds
get
great.
coffee.
And thank you, Vidyu, for making this possible. Have to thank her for getting us together and going with it. So thanks all. And I will see you soon. Take care. Have a happy
Thanks.
Monday.
Thanks, everyone.